Akin to Love by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Read for Love Stories Volume 5 by Krista Zaleski. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Akin to Love. Lucy Maud Montgomery. David Hartley had dropped in to pay a neighborly call on Josephine Elliott. It was well along in the afternoon, and outside in the clear crispness of a Canadian winter, the long blue shadows from the tall fir trees behind the house were falling over the snow. It was a frosty day, and all the windows of every room where there was no fire were covered with silver palms. But the big, bright kitchen was warm and cozy, and somehow seemed to David more tempting than ever before, and that is saying a good deal. He had an uneasy feeling that he had stayed long enough and ought to go. Josephine was knitting at a long gray sock with doubly aggressive energy, and that was a sign that she was talked out. As long as Josephine had plenty to say, her plump white fingers, where her mother's wedding ring was lost in dimples, moved slowly among her needles. When conversation flagged, she fell to her work as furiously as if a husband and half a dozen sons were waiting for its completion. David often wondered in his secret soul what Josephine did with all the interminable gray socks she knitted. Sometimes he concluded that she put them in the home missionary barrels, again that she sold them to her hired man. At any rate, they were very warm and comfortable looking, and David sighed as he thought of the deplorable state his own socks were generally in. When David sighed, Josephine took alarm. She was afraid David was going to have one of his attacks of foolishness. She must head him off some way, so she rolled up the gray sock, stabbed the big pudgy ball with her needles, and said she guessed she'd get the tea. David got up. "Now, you're not going before tea," said Josephine hospitably. "I'll have it all ready in no time." "I ought to go home, I suppose," said David, with the air and tone of a man dallying with a great temptation. "Zilla'll be waiting tea for me, and there's the stock to tend to." "I guess Zillah won't wait long," said Josephine. She did not intend it at all, but there was a certain scornful ring in her voice. "You must stay. I've a fancy for company to tea." David sat down again. He looked so pleased that Josephine went down on her knees behind the stove, ostensibly to get a stick of firewood, but really to hide her smile. "I suppose he's tickled to death to think of getting a good square meal, after the starvation rations Zillah puts him on," she thought. But Josephine misjudged David just as much as he misjudged her. She had really asked him to stay to tea out of pity, but David thought it was because she was lonesome, and he hailed that as an encouraging sign. And he was not thinking about getting a good meal either, although his dinner had been such a one as only Zillah Hartley could get up. As he leaned back in his cushioned chair and watched Josephine bustling about the kitchen, he was glorying in the fact that he could spend another hour with her, and sit opposite to her at the table while she poured his tea for him and passed him the biscuits, just as if... Here Josephine looked straight at him with such intent and stern brown eyes that David felt she must have read his thoughts, and he colored guiltily. But Josephine did not even notice that he was blushing. She had only paused to wonder whether she would bring out cherry or strawberry preserve, and, having decided on the cherry, took her piercing gaze from David without having seen him at all. But he allowed his thoughts no more vagaries. Josephine set the table with her mother's wedding china. She used it because it was the anniversary of her mother's wedding day, but David thought it was out of compliment to him. And as he knew quite well that Josephine prized that china beyond all her other earthly possessions, he stroked his smooth-shaven, dimpled chin with the air of a man to whom is offered a very subtly sweet homage. Josephine whisked in and out of the pantry and up and down cellar, and with every whisk a new dainty was added to the table. Josephine, as everybody in Meadowby admitted, was past mistress in the noble art of cookery. Once upon a time rash matrons and ambitious young wives had aspired to rival her, but they had long ago realized the vanity of such efforts and dropped comfortably back to second place. Josephine felt an artist's pride in her table when she set the teapot on its stand and invited David to sit in. There were pink slices of cold tongue and crisp green pickles and spiced gooseberry, the recipe for which Josephine had invented herself, and which had taken first prize at the provincial exhibition for 6 successive years. There was a lemon pie, which was a symphony in gold and silver, biscuits as light and as white as snow, and moist, plummy cubes of fruit cake. There was the ruby-tinted cherry preserve, a mound of amber jelly, and, to crown all, steaming cups of tea in flavor and fragrance unequaled. And Josephine, too, sitting at the head of the table, with her smooth, glossy crimps of black hair and cheeks as rosy clear as they had been 20 years ago, when she had been a slender slip of girlhood and bashful young David Hartley had looked at her over his hymn book in prayer meeting and tramped all the way home a few feet behind her, because he was too shy to go boldly up and ask if he might see her home. All taken together, what wonder if David lost his head over that tea-table, and determined to ask Josephine the same old question once more. It was 18 years since he had asked it for the first time, and 2 years since the last. He would try his luck again. Josephine was certainly more gracious than he remembered her to ever have been before. When the meal was over, Josephine cleared the table and washed the dishes. When she had taken a dry towel and sat down by the window to polish her china, David understood that his opportunity had come. He moved over and sat down beside her on the sofa by the window. Outside, the sun was setting in a magnificent arch of light and color over the snow-clad hills and deep blue St. Lawrence Gulf. David grasped at the sunset as an introductory factor. "Isn't it fine, Josephine?" he said admiringly. "It makes me think of that piece of poetry that used to be in the old Fifth Reader when we went to school. Do you mind how the teacher used to drill us up in it on Friday afternoons? It begun, 'Slow sinks more lovely ere his race is run, along Moriah's hills the setting sun.'" Then David declaimed the whole passage in a sing-song tone, accompanied by a few crude gestures recalled from long-ago schoolboy elocution. Josephine knew what was coming. Every time David proposed to her, he had begun by reciting poetry. She twirled her towel around the last plate resignedly. If it had to come, the sooner it was over, the better. Josephine knew by experience that there was no heading David off, despite his shyness, when he had once got along as far as the poetry. "But it's going to be for the last time," she said determinedly. "I'm going to settle this question so decidedly tonight that there'll never be a repetition." When David had finished his quotation, he laid his hand on Josephine's plump arm. "Josephine," he said huskily, "I suppose you couldn't, could you now, make up your mind to have me? I wish you would, Josephine, I wish you would. Don't you think you could, Josephine?" Josephine folded up her towel, crossed her hands on it, and looked her wooer squarely in the eyes. "David Hartley," she said deliberately, "what makes you go on asking me to marry you every once in a while, when I've told you times out of mind that I can't and won't?" "Because I can't help hoping that you'll change your mind through time," David replied meekly. "Will you just listen to me? I will not marry you. That is in the first place. And in the second, this is to be final. It has to be. You are never to ask me this again under any circumstances. If you do, I will not answer you. I will not let on I hear you at all. But," and Josephine spoke very slowly and impressively, "I will never speak to you again. Never. We are good friends now, and I like you real well, and like to have you drop in for a neighborly chat as often as you wish to. But there'll be an end, short and sudden, to that, if you don't mind what I say." "Oh, Josephine, ain't that rather hard?" protested David feebly. It seemed terrible to be cut off from all hope with such finality as this. "I mean every word of it," returned Josephine calmly. "You'd better go home now, David. I always feel as if I'd like to be alone for a spell after a disagreeable experience." David obeyed sadly and put on his cap and overcoat.